Aegon's carpenters had shaped it after the land of Westeros, sawing out each bay and peninsula until the table nowhere ran straight. On its surface, darkened by near 300 years of varnish, were painted the Seven Kingdoms, as they had been in Aegon's day. Rivers, mountains, castles and cities, lakes and forests, the thoughts of Maester Crescent, A Clash of Kings, Prologue. Aegon Targaryen invaded Westeros in 2 BC, an event that would fundamentally change Westeros forever, and while we cannot know why he chose this exact moment to strike out from Dragonstone, the common train of thought was he believed the political situation unstable enough that many of the kings would not be able to organise a unified defence. While we can never know his true motivations and why he chose this very moment, he did. And one thing we can say for sure is Westeros, as it had been for generations, was divided into several quarrelsome kingdoms, and there was hardly a time when 2 or 3 of these kingdoms was not at war with another. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterward he gave them peace, prosperity and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71, Daenerys 6. In the vast, cold, stony north, by far the largest of the kingdoms in landmass, was ruled by House Stark of Winterfell, the Kings of Winter. In the harsh deserts of Dawn, the Martell princes held sway for generations after a marriage pact with Nymeria and her Rhoynish refugees settled the coastline. The gold-rich Westerlands were ruled by the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, the fertile Reach by the Gardeners of Highgarden, who acted as the breadbasket to much of Westeros. The Vale of Arryn, the Fingers and the Mountain of the Moon belonged to House Arryn, but was under the regency of Queen Regent Shara Arryn, as her son King Ronald was but a small child. All of these kingdoms would give Aegon their own challenges, but at the start of the Conquest, it seemed that the Storm King and the King of the Isles of Rivers would give Aegon the biggest challenge. This is what made the initial conquest a more challenging prospect, given that these 2 belligerent kings were the 2 whose realms lay closest to Dragonstone, Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant. From the ancient great castle perched upon cliff edges, this Storm's End is an old place. There are spells woven into the stones, dark walls that no shadow can pass, ancient, forgotten, yet still in place. Melisandre to Davos Seaworth, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 42, Davos 2. Storm's End, the seat of the Storm Kings of House Targaryen, had once ruled the eastern half of Westeros, from Cape Wrath to the Bay of Crabs, but their power had been dwindling for centuries. They would follow a pattern of growth, then rapid decline, before expanding their borders once more. The Gardener Kings of the Reach had slowly chipped away at their dominion from the west. The Dornishmen harassed them from the south in the form of raids into the Dornish marches, and King Harren the Black and his Iron Men had pushed them from the Trident and the lands north of the Blackwater Rush, with Harren controlling not just the Iron Islands, but the Riverlands as well, with an eye of further expansion to the contested coastline around Blackwater Bay. King Argilac Durrandon had slowed the decline for a time, turning back a Dornish invasion while still a boy, then also crossing the Narrow Sea to join a great alliance against the Imperialist Tigers of Atlantis, and slaying Garsk the Seventh Gardener, King of the Reach, in the Battle of Summerfield 20 years later. He even now looked to expand his borders further north, into the area that would become the Crown Lands. But time waits for no man, and Argilac had grown older, and was not the warrior he had once been. His famous mane of black hair had gone grey, and his prowess at arms had faded. While he was by far feeble, it was clear he was not the man of his youth, who had done all of these great deeds. Harren had beggared the Riverlands and Iron Islands alike to ornate his dream. The Thoughts of Catelyn Stark, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 7, Catelyn 1. North of the Blackwater River, the Riverlands were ruled by the bloody hand of Harren the Black, of House Hoare, the king of the Isles and Rivers. House Hoare had spent the last few generations conquering and stabilising the Riverlands under their rule, reaching its apex with Harren. Harren's grandsire, Harwin Hardhand, had taken the trident from Argilac's grandfather, Arek. whose own forebearers had thrown down the last of the River Kings centuries earlier. Harren's own father had extended his domains east to Duskendale and Rosby. Harren himself had devoted much of his long reign, close to near 40 years, to building the gigantic castle beside the God's Eye, known as Harrenhal, pouring much of the wealth and resources and manpower, not just of the Riverlands, but of the Iron Islands as well, into its construction. Harrenhal was built on a scale never seen since in Westeros, and no castle like it had been built since the Age of Heroes, in the days after the Long Night. But with Harrenhal finally nearing completion, the Ironborn would soon be free to seek fresh conquests, using Harren's great castle as a launching point into the southern kingdoms of Westeros. The reason Harren was so keen in taking the area that would become the Crown Lands was very simple. By doing so, House Hall would now control a large amount of coast on the eastern coast of Westeros, meaning they could control the landmass from coast to coast, which would allow them to more easily field its navy in the narrow sea, without having to sail around the whole of Westeros and up the Stepstones. The situation on the borders of the Riverlands and the Stormlands was tense, and it would not have taken much for it to spill over into a full-on war. A war King Argilac knew he would struggle to win. No king in Westeros was more feared than Black Harren, whose cruelty had become legendary all throughout the Seven Kingdoms, with the effective use of slaves in all but name to build Harrenhal. But no king in Westeros felt more threatened than Argilac Durrandon, the Storm King, with the aging warrior's only heir his maiden daughter, with the succession beyond her either non-existent or very unclear. Should Argilac die, it is thought by many historians that the kingdom of the Stormlands would have shattered into petty kingdoms, being eaten up by the bigger neighbouring kingdoms. But why was this so? It's because there had never been a ruling queen in the Stormlands, and it's believed very few would have followed Argilac Durrandon, her father's heir or not. We believe it's because of this the Storm King took a more diplomatic solution, something very much against his nature. He reached out to the Dragon Lords of House Targaryen on Dragonstone, offering Lord Aegon Targaryen his daughter in marriage, with all the lands east of the God's Eye, from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush, as her dowry, the very lands currently being contested by Argilac and Harren. Aegon, of course, refused the Storm King's proposal. Rightly, he pointed out in his reply that he already had 2 wives, and did not need a third, and the lands being offered had belonged to House Hall for more than a generation. While contested by House Durrandon, they were not Argilac's to give away, when he technically, at this time, did not hold them. Plainly, the old Storm King meant to establish House Targaryen along the coast of Blackwater Bay in their own petty kingdom as a buffer zone between his own lands and those of Harren the Black, believing Harren would be a fool to try and invade this hypothetical petty kingdom with dragon lords in control. In principle, is not an awful plan, and a lesser lord may have accepted these terms. But Argilac wasn't treating with a lesser lord. He did not view House Targaryen as his equals. They were not kings, and while this is true, he forgot one key factor. They were the last Dragon Lords of Old Valyria. The very thing that would have offered Argilac protection was vastly underestimated by him. It does seem that Aegon was at the very least willing to entertain the discussions, and we are not entirely sure how long before the Conquest itself these talks took place. Some suggested it could have been months, others several years. Much of history during this era is vague and lost to time, mostly being speculation, based on the events we know occurred. The Lord of Dragonstone countered with his own offer. He would take the dower lands being offered if Argilac would also cede Massey's Hook and the woods and plains from the Blackwater south to the River Wendwater and the headwaters of the Mander. The pact would be sealed by the marriage of Argilac's daughter, Argella, to Orys Baratheon, Lord Aegon's childhood friend and champion, and unknown to the wider nobility of Westeros at the time, Aegon's bastard half-brother. But Argilac did know of Orys Baratheon's bastardy. Thus, Argilac the Arrogant rejected these terms in a rage. He insisted he would not dishonour his daughter by giving her hand in marriage to a bastard. The very suggestion enraged him. He had the hands of Aegon's envoy cut off and returned to him in a box. "These are the only hands you shall have of me," he is said to have wrote, in a reply to Aegon. Some say that Aegon expected Argilac's angry response, and thus never had any intention of sending a reply. Aegon once stood here as I do now, looking down on this table. Do you think we would name him Aegon the Conqueror today if he had not had dragons? Stannis Baratheon to Davos Seaworth, A Storm of Swords Chapter 54, Davos 5. Instead, he called his banners, summoning his friends, lords, and allies to attend him on Dragonstone. The numbers were small, mostly made up of seats around Blackwater Bay itself. The most prominent of these lords were the Velaryons of Driftmark, who had been close allies of House Targaryen since they arrived to Dragonstone from Valyria before the Doom, and had been sworn to them ever since. As were the Celtigars of Claw Isle. Both House Velaryon and Celtigar were Valyrian houses. However, they were very minor, and were not dragon lords like the Targaryens. From Massey's Hook came Lord Bar Emmon of Sharp Point and Lord Massey of Stonedance, both of whom had been sworn to Storm's End and the Storm Kings, but with close ties to Dragonstone since the arrival of House Targaryen. Aegon and his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, took counsel with them in the chamber of the Painted Table as they laid out their plan for the coming conquest. It is said that after this meeting, they visited the castle sept to pray to the Seven, though Aegon himself had never actually been known as a pious or religious man. In fact, it is believed that Aegon actively converted House Targaryen to the faith of the Seven, with the simple goal of making their future conquest of Westeros more palatable to the lords and small folk who might mistrust their old Valyrian gods and customs. This may have been a smart move, given how the idea of blood magic and sacrifice has become associated with the power of old Valyria. On the seventh day, a cloud of ravens burst from the towers of Dragonstone to bring Aegon's word to the seven kingdoms of Westeros. To the seven kings they flew, to the citadel of Oldtown, to lords both great and small. Each bird carried the same message. From this day forth, there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles. Those who took up arms against him would be thrown down and humbled and destroyed. We know the myth that Aegon and his sisters never set foot in Westeros before the conquest, and we also know that in reality, they did at least visit Oldtown and likely Lannisport and other places beyond. This is all very much clearly shown in Aegon's preparation for the conquest. He clearly would have been in communication with his lords, and I think it's possible he visited places like Sharp Point and Massey's Hook to negotiate with the likes of Lord Bar Emmon and Lord Massey about joining him over Argilac. Yes, we know that these houses had grown closer since House Targaryen had arrived on Dragonstone, but they were still fundamentally sworn to House Durrandon. Something Aegon said or did convince them to swap sides. You also have to consider the idea that Aegon likely would have scouted the area around Blackwater Bay, looking for the right place to land when he started his conquest. The location that would become known as King's Landing was not just randomly chosen. It wasn't just where they happened to come ashore. It was picked for its prime location at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, with 3 defendable hills between 2 of Aegon's biggest threats during the conquest in Harren and Argilac. When you combine this idea with the existence of the Painted Table, it's clear that not only was Aegon planning this conquest for a long time, but he had likely spent time in Westeros scouting out the area that would become the Crown Lands, and maybe even meeting with some of the lords around the bay. Another idea that really changes how you view the concept of Aegon and his sisters never having been to Westeros before the landing is the fact, well, they're dragon riders. It's very likely they explored the Crown Lands and further afield on their dragons. While this is just pure speculation on my part, I just cannot see them flying around Blackwater Bay haphazardly. Building on this, most people do just assume House Targaryen was sat on Dragonstone for hundreds of years prior to the conquest, and while we do know little about what they actually did, it's very likely that men and women of House Targaryen had at some point spent time in Westeros, even if it was casually visiting places. Dragonstone, after all, is a small island with not much on it. I'm sure they would have found a reason to explore and travel Westeros somewhat. Plus, having dragons would certainly make it easier. While the reality of this myth is just that, a myth, its existence does add to the story and legend that is Aegon the Conqueror and his conquest of Westeros.